Climate change is going to be bad. We don't know exactly how bad, but general estimates range from pretty bad to really, really bad. Depending on how you project the growth of carbon concentration in the atmosphere, average surface temperatures could climb 5 degrees Celsius or higher. This could lead to sea levels rising over 2 meters by 2100. Policymakers at the local, state, and national level have taken some steps to avert the crisis. Renewable portfolio standards and mileage guidelines for cars have become popular tools for limiting carbon emissions, but the consensus among scientists is that much more needs to be done. The problem is, there are few issues as polarizing as climate change.
So it's very, very cold out, very unseasonal. So here, Mr. President, catch this.
But what if I told you that there's a policy solution that might be able to bridge the gap between progressives and conservatives, environmentalists and businesses, climate hawks and climate skeptics? That policy is called the Great Swap. Let's take a closer look. This is British Columbia. It's home to the world's biggest hockey stick, the longest unsupported cable car at 9,921 feet, and it's one of the only places in North America with a tax on carbon emissions. British Columbia levies a tax of $30 for every metric ton of carbon dioxide emitted. For perspective, the average US household generates 41 metric tons of CO2 emissions every year. BC's carbon tax raises the price of gasoline by about 20 cents per gallon, and it raises electricity prices by about a penny per kilowatt hour. To offset the cost for taxpayers, the BC government has instituted several tax cuts in other areas. This makes their carbon tax revenue neutral. In other words, all the money that comes in is paid back to taxpayers. Now, BC is a small province with only 4.6 million people, and its carbon tax has only been in effect for a few years. So there's still some debate over how much it has reduced emissions. But advocates for carbon taxes, or carbon pricing, believe it could have a dramatic impact on emissions in the United States. This is the central premise of the Great Swap, a carbon tax proposal written by Joseph Aldy. Professor Aldy is from Kentucky, his favorite movie is All the President's Men, and he's an associate professor of public policy at Harvard Kennedy School. At the heart of Professor Aldy's proposal is a carbon tax that would start at $25 for every metric ton of CO2, and increase annually as businesses and consumers adjust.
The Great Swap is really premised on two swaps. The first swap is reducing our taxes on things that are good, like people working and productive investments, by financing that through taxes on things that are bad, like pollution that contributes to climate change. The second swap is recognizing that we can be more effective at addressing climate change by putting a tax on the emissions that contribute to the problem, instead of more conventional approaches through regulation.
When crafting new policies, lawmakers use a carrot and stick approach to encourage good behavior and discourage bad behavior. A carrot is a reward for something good or productive. A stick is a punishment for something bad or harmful. Now, I'm not a big fan of carrots, but let's pretend like carrots are objectively good and sticks are objectively bad. In this analogy, the carbon tax would be a stick meant to discourage the use of fossil fuels. Rather than burning coal or gasoline, a robust carbon tax would nudge consumers and businesses to seek out cleaner alternatives like solar. It could also spur investment in energy efficiency and conservation efforts. The carrot would be the revenue generated by the carbon tax. That money would be paid out to taxpayers, either as a reduction in income tax rates or literally as a check mailed to each taxpayer once a year. One of the reasons that Professor Aldy and other carbon tax advocates like this policy is that it'd be relatively simple to do. We already collect data from energy producers on how much coal they're mining or how much oil they're drilling. Adding tax collection to this process would be administratively simple. The tax payout would also be simple. We already send checks to Social Security recipients. The Great Swap could adopt a similar approach. The other reason that some policy experts favor this solution is because it presents a compromise for liberals and conservatives. Liberals get a fairly robust, meaningful tax on pollution that could dramatically influence consumer behavior. Conservatives get fiscal reform that shifts the tax burden from laborers to polluters. Now, the tax reform aspect of the Great Swap isn't the only instrument meant to appeal to conservatives. As part of the proposal, Professor Aldy suggests rolling back some environmental regulations that would become redundant once the carbon tax was in place. He reasons that once consumers must face a tax on energy-intensive products, they'll automatically seek out alternatives that don't have the same carbon footprint. And there is a small but growing group of conservatives who have endorsed similar policies for combating climate change. One such conservative is former Congressman Bob Inglis. Congressman Inglis served 6 terms in the House of Representatives for South Carolina's 4th Congressional District. He's a former Institute of Politics fellow, and he likes oatmeal.
I think what mostly people on the right have heard is some well-meaning people on the left saying, here's what we're going to do. We're going to grow the government, and we're going to solve this problem. And conservatives say, no, you're not. You're not going to grow the government, and I don't think you're going to solve the problem that way.
Inglis is now executive director of republicen.org, a coalition of conservatives and libertarians that favor market approaches to fighting climate change rather than regulations and subsidies.
We have to come along and convince them that there's a very different solution that involves actually a smaller government. We can actually reduce the size of the EPA by eliminating some Clean Air Act regulations that would become redundant if we were to price carbon dioxide. If we tell conservatives that and get that message through, then they could say, now you're singing our tune. That's our language. We can sing that back.
Of course, a policy like the Great Swap isn't exactly a slam dunk for liberals, and there's a few reasons for that. One is that progressives would have a lot of justifiable concerns about how the revenue would be distributed to taxpayers. In order to get liberals on board with the Great Swap, the distribution of carbon tax revenue would need to be progressive. Lower income families would need to receive bigger checks. This would be particularly important given that these families spend a larger share of their income on energy expenditures compared to high-income earners. It's also possible that environmentalists wouldn't get on board with the rollback of regulations. This is partly because while a carbon tax would make it more expensive to burn fossil fuels, it doesn't outright limit their use, and it's difficult to anticipate just how big an impact such a tax would have. Professor Aldy estimates that his tax proposal of $25 per ton of CO2 would lower emissions 26% by 2025. But this is just an estimate. Professor Aldy could be wrong. To get some input on this regulatory issue, I reached out to Gina McCarthy. She's the former administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. She's a big Red Sox fan, and she's a 2017 fellow at the Harvard Institute of Politics. McCarthy ran the EPA during the rollout of the Clean Power Plan, a new set of rules meant to reduce carbon pollution from utilities.
EPA's mission isn't to utilize a specific tool, it's to get reductions. If the American people find a better way or a comparable way that they like better, I would be all for it.
But there's a caveat.
The challenge you're going to have is that the science of climate is changing. I would want to make sure that anything put in place was revisited periodically to make sure that it keeps up with the science and what it tells us.
To be clear, the Great Swap includes a mechanism by which policymakers could reassess the program's impact every 5 years. Another objection that voters on both the left and the right might have to a carbon tax is the effect it would have on American competitiveness. A domestic carbon tax would make American products and services more expensive than those coming from other countries. To correct for this, Professor Aldy proposes implementing a border tax on imports from countries that don't have their own carbon pricing regime. That way, our manufacturers can compete on a level playing field with international firms, and the U.S. can use its carbon tax as a stick to encourage other countries to join us in fighting climate change. That's going to be a tough fight. Whether climate change turns out to be pretty bad or really, really bad, it's a big problem, and it's going to take big solutions to fix it. The Great Swap may or may not be the right approach, but given the consequences of inaction, let's hope that policymakers come up with some carrots and sticks very, very soon.